Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of Waterloo's Department of Communication Arts Speaker Series, Communication Speaks. The committee, David Jansen, Leonard Nakay, and I are delighted to present Shama Rangwala and Desmond who will be speaking about their podcast, Replay. As we gather here, we are all coming into a virtual space and arriving from different locations. I'm in Toronto, or Tikaranto, which is Mohawk, which means the place in the water where the trees are standing. This is also the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississauga of the Credit, and is held within the Dish with One Spoon, a covenant among nations and newcomers to promise to be caretakers of the land and water and all beings. Now, often I take the GO train. I take the GO train to the University of Waterloo, and while I'm traveling, I pass through Seneca territory as I head into Attawattaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee territory. And what struck me along this journey as I travel by train is that I'm actually using one of the many industrial instruments of colonization. The railway manifested Western expansionism and caused so much devastation and displacement that continues to impact Indigenous peoples' lives today. By seeing my connection to the land, I also see how embedded and naturalized colonial structures and systems are within my everyday. And making these normalized and often invisible colonial systems visible, it becomes critical to do this when social change. Shama Rangwala and Desmond do this critical work and more by identifying systemic discrimination through their activism, writing, pedagogy, praxis, and now their podcast. Thank you again for being here. Committee member David Jansen will now introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Soraya, and thanks to all of you for joining us. In this evening's event, we're very privileged to welcome our two guests, Shama Rangwala and Desmond Cole. Shama is assistant professor in the Department of Humanities at York University. Her intermedia and interdisciplinary research focuses on the adaptations of racial capitalism through the modern history of settler colonialism. Her other research includes the cross-disciplinary project Sounding Race and public humanities project Pedagogy and Practice. Her public-facing work has appeared in Jacobin, The Star, The Globe and Mail, and Canada Land, and she is a regular panelist on Alberta Prime Time on CTV. Desmond Cole is an award-winning journalist, radio host, and activist in Toronto. His writing has appeared in the Toronto Star, Toronto Life, The Walrus, Now Magazine, Ethnic Isle, Torontoist, BuzzFeed, and the Ottawa Citizen. Cole's first book, a brilliant and wonderful book, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power, which was released in 2020, has foregrounded and redefined national conversations on systemic racism and policing in Canada. Today, Shama and Desmond also are presenting a new joint podcast called Replay that focuses their critical energy on diverse works of popular culture and media. Please join me in welcoming Shama Rangwala and Desmond Cole.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, David. So hi, everybody. I am speaking to you all from Amiskwichi, Waskahigan, Treaty 6 territory, otherwise known as Edmonton, Alberta. I'm so excited to talk to you all about our fun project Replay podcast. So this is part of the greater project that David mentioned, Pedagogy and Praxis, which is my project about taking the things that we do inside the university outside and really kind of engaging with public scholarship. So Replay is a really big part of that. It's our first kind of big public project out of it. Okay, next slide, please. So this podcast is Culture and Politics. So Desmond and I talk a lot about culture all the time. We watch shows together. If you've listened to the podcast, the very first thing we watched together was Jurassic Park. So that was our first episode. So we're really interested in thinking about culture as this terrain of, contestation. So also we're both big fans of Stuart Hall. We're just talking today how, we wish he were still with us to help us understand this moment. But I have a quotation from Stuart Hall on, one definition of culture up here on the screen. So culture means the actual grounded terrain of practices, representations, languages, and customs of any specific historical society. So there are a lot of words in there. It's culture is a practice, it is a mediation, it is ritual, it's behavior, it's specific to a time and place, it's grounded in material conditions, historical, it's social. It's also the contradictory forms of common sense. So common sense as, this thing that we accept to be neutral and natural, but actually, is a terrain of contestation. And it helps shape popular life. And so one of the questions that we are asking repeatedly through this podcast is, why does culture matter? And what is the relationship between culture and material conditions? So books and books, whole body of work, really the field of cultural studies, looking at this question. And this is, what is the relationship between the material conditions in which a piece of culture like a TV show or a movie emerges, and what can culture do in the world? Is there any kind of effect that culture can have on those material conditions? And this is last bit on the slide is very important to us. It can also be a pleasure to study and talk about culture. And so a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, we critique it. We're like, yeah, this is really, just about kind of laundering imperialism, or here's how this TV show reproduces racial capitalism, but also maybe we kind of like it, right? So a lot of the shows that we watch, it's like all your faves are problematic. Let's talk about it. And yeah, so that's one of the things that we're gonna be doing today with you all. Okay, next slide, please. So my work is on the adaptations of racial capitalism. So I look at how the ideologies that provide cover for the violences, exclusion, dominations of racial capitalism, how those ideologies of liberalism, of individualism, of meritocracy, those kinds of things, how they adapt across time. And so what we wanted to talk about today with you all are the adaptations of this genre of pop culture that, even if you don't seek it out, has probably found you, and that is propaganda. And so in this slide, just very kind of broadly tracing the strokes of what we are thinking about with these adaptations in the 70s and 80s. You have like the strong white man cop, maybe he has some like romantic dalliances. He carries a gun with him. He's protecting white property. There's some kind of like vague, shadowy crime, and he's out there keeping the streets safe. That, changed a little bit as historical conditions changed, as calls for representation changed. And so, we see in kind of later decades, especially in the 90s, there was often colorblind casting, colorblind in quotation marks, of course, where, the cops, we were thinking like even the dad on Family Matters is a cop. There's usually like a black cop in some show that you're watching, but they're not really constantly talking about their racialization, what it means to be a police officer, what it means to be part of an institution whose origins, which, if you know Desmond's work, he talks about it in his book and in other places, the origins of policing are specifically anti-Black, specifically capitalist, racial capitalist. We will also talk a little bit about the propaganda that we see more recently. And that is the kind of representational politics, liberal diversity propaganda, where the cops probably, racialized and struggling with being part of the police. And this is as it becomes harder to deny the racial violence, the specifically racist violence, anti-Black violence of policing, these shows have had to adapt to that increased visibility of that violence. And so the way that propaganda has worked is to have a racialized cop, most often a Black police officer, most often a Black male police officer, grappling with racist policing. But the narrative itself ultimately reinforces that the need is for reform, that it's not fundamental to the institution, that this cop will work really hard within the institution to change it. And that has the function to erase the systemic conditions, even as it makes that violence really visible. It contains it through the narrative of this kind of individual working to change the system from within. Now, what I've just described is really broad strokes, and we can of course think of examples from each of these periods that do not do this. There are instances of individual episodes of a show that maybe does, do that kind of liberal narrative, but maybe they're like these little sparks within it where the structural conditions are kind of laid bare. But as we're talking today, we are really kind of focusing on that general trend and some examples of that trend, which tracks with, again, the material conditions of, say, technologies like smartphones, where people can see that violence happening, and then cop shows have to adapt to it. So yeah, that is kind of our framework for today. And I'm just going to pass it over to Desmond and get into those specific examples. Take it away.
Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me okay. And there we go. So, in preparation for our conversation today, I got really excited about all of the thoughts about this evolution and this adaptation of propaganda and of the need to do so because of a larger need to adapt in the real world. The narratives of policing needing to change, in my work as a journalist, for example, reading a lot about how this idea, for example, this very modern idea that we should have more diversity on our police forces, meaning more Black people in most cases, because diversity was never really meant to satisfy anybody in this particular context other than us as Black people, particularly like in Canada, where I'm sitting here, and also in Treaty 13 territory in Takaranto or Toronto. In so many of the literature that we see starting in the 70s and early 80s, there's this articulation of a problem that policing is generally good. Policing is completely necessary and indispensable, but a lot of Black people seem to be complaining about it. They've got some kind of problem with this institution. And we won't articulate in these reports, right, that their problem is policing itself, police brutality, jail, all the associated parts of the criminal justice system, capitalism. No, their problem is that some of them have bad experiences with the police. But you know what we should do? We should put more Black people on the police force. And that'll solve the problems. Now, of course, it wouldn't, and it hasn't for 30 years. And even in 2021, we now see that police forces across Canada that are desperate to show some kind of action when their existence is harm to Black and Indigenous people. They nevertheless want to show that they're making things better. And still in 2021, the idea of diversifying the police force is presented as though it is something radical, reformist, new. And I started looking back at the TV shows that I can think of growing up. Now, the first one on the screen here, Miami Vice, I was 2 years old when this show debuted, so I don't remember watching Miami Vice. I just know of it because it is one of those legendary shows. And if you look at this image and on the ones that we're about to look at here, you kind of start to see really immediately that a couple of things are important in these shows. And it changes over time. But there are a couple of things that are really important that in the imaging of these shows even just stays quite constant. And the first is that there has to be at least one Black person. And if it's a Black man, even better. A Black man is almost required. So you're not going to see a whole lot of cop shows that don't have at least one Black cop as a man, cis male person in them. And that is directly, as Shama was saying, it's directly in response to material conditions and to people saying the police are mistreating us as Black people. And so we can individualize now these narratives, right? We can have the story of the upright Black cop who escaped the hood, who escaped the ghetto, who got an education, as if cops went to school. Sorry for all the cops in the room who are highly educated. But like, you know, breaking that stereotype out of his community and then making it into the kind of, you know, law-abiding citizen stakeholder side of things. So, you know, you definitely start seeing that in Miami Vice in 1984. 1987, we have The Lethal Weapon with Danny Glover and Mel Gibson. And, you know, we see how humor can be added into this equation as well. It doesn't have to be this dire and serious drama. It can be a kind of odd couple dynamic going on with Black cop and white cop, unlikely partners teaming up, getting into hijinks, getting into trouble with each other, having some fun along the way, but also ultimately reinforcing and reifying the American dream of working hard, following the rules, very important, following the rules, and being on the right side of the law. Law and Order 1990. For those of you who only know the newer iterations of Law and Order, this is how it started. This is what it looked like. I so love this image. But again, you know, and you almost see how our friend on the left here is foregrounded in this image, as if to say like, hey, I know you see all these other guys here, but pay special attention. There's something going on. And now we're in the 90s where I think this whole representation thing really goes on steroids and just begins to completely take over all of our television narratives, not just about policing. When I was 12, this show came out, New York Undercover. I'm sure many of you have never heard of it. I would so love to watch this show again for our podcast and to see how it holds up in 2021. When I was 12 years old, the show was on TV, and me and my best friend loved this show so much. And this goes back to, again, what Shama was saying earlier about like not necessarily hating that which we are critiquing. I loved this show growing up. I love another show that we're about to talk about in just a moment, which is a cop show, which does all the same things that I'm talking about and critiquing here. But the reason I was drawn to this show as a 12-year-old boy, New York Undercover, was because the two people you see at the bottom, the two men cops at the bottom here, had this really like hood dynamic to them, where they didn't talk like they were like A students. They were a little bit rough around the edges. They were from the hood for real themselves, and they understood the places that they were policing. And as a 12-year-old, I thought that was so cool and deep. And, you know, I got into that. I had to bring up this next example of Law and Order SVU. So now we're almost a decade out from when this show debuted, and we get SVU, which is the spin-off to Law and Order that a lot of people know very well. And here in this picture, we have Ice-T, as he was known when he was a rapper, and is still known as his stage name, right? And Ice-T became very famous as a rapper in the 80s and 90s for, among other things, talking about killing cops. So what a coup, right? What a wonderful capture for this cop show to have this person who to an entire generation of Black people represented, and Black young men in particular, represented a kind of Black masculinity in resistance and opposition to this institution of policing. And here he is on the other side of the screen. Is that because Ice-T the Rapper is just a persona? And then this actor that we see on the screen in SVU is also just a persona? I mean, these are the kind of things that we want to think about and to talk about. This one's my favorite. The Wire, debuted in 2002. Again, love this image, love this portrayal of like a poster for the show. Never sad to see Idris Elba's face anywhere. But you know, one of the things that this show does is I think of a character in The Wire named Bunk Moreland, and Bunk is one of the investigators. And he has this dialogue with like one of the greatest characters in the history of television, who is Omar. And Omar is a bad guy who we all love in The Wire because he has his own code, his own way of speaking, and his own way of moving around in this kind of Baltimore drug scene. And Bunk Moreland, the cop, has this back and forth with Omar at one very pivotal point in the series, where Bunk Moreland talks about the fact that they're from the same neighborhood and that he was always told by the rough and tumble boys in his neighborhood, go home, you know you don't belong here. And then, of course, he became a cop. And it's not to say that I couldn't imagine that ever happening in real life, but ultimately, again, what this does is solidify and reinforce this idea that there are different rules for different Black people in society, and the ones who play by the rules end up like Bunk Moreland, and the ones who don't end up like our friend Omar. And I won't tell you what happens to Omar if you've never seen The Wire, because you should watch it. But the show is definitely trying to tell us something about the two different paths that two men like these, both Black, are taking. I had to throw in a couple more examples here before I throw it back to Shama, which are Rush Hour 3 in 2007 with, you know, Jackie Chan on the left and Chris Tucker on the right. How in the hell did they make 4 of these? Our podcast is 100% thinking about, you know, the saturation in our culture of like things like this, where you can make 7 of them for, you know, for money reasons, because people will pay to go to your theater to watch these again. Rush Hour 3 and the Rush Hour series in general made this list for me because it's like, you don't even need white people anymore, as you can see here. Now the white people are actually going to be the butt of these two men of color's jokes. They are going to be the cops and represent the law and order, but they're going to do it with swag, right? They're going to do it with style and martial arts, and it's going to be really funny, and all the jokes are going to be on white people, but in the end, law and order still reigns, is still upheld. We're still the good guys going after the bad guys here, but we don't anymore need any kind of interlocutors or sidekicks. And then, of course, finally, we're talking about doing a Will Smith replay podcast coming up. There's just so much to talk about, from all of his movies to, we're both Fresh Prince of Bel-Air devotees. And I should mention too, just speaking of the Fresh Prince, that one of the reasons that replay is possible as a podcast is because of services like Crave and Disney Plus and Netflix, which allow us to have such easy access these days to these cultural products from the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s. This would have been very difficult, if not impossible, for the average person to do 40 years ago. But we can literally tell our audiences now, hey, go watch this first if you haven't seen it, and then come enjoy the podcast. So I've been watching Will Smith on TV since I was a boy, and now we have to suffer through Bad Boys for Life because they want to sell Will Smith back to my 40-year-old ass in 2020 and get me to go out to the theater once again. I will not see this movie. I did not see it when it came out. However, It's more of what I'm talking about here now, where this man has become Martin Lawrence is no slouch himself, but Will Smith, I think we can all agree, has become one of the most iconic actors of his time. And he's probably played a cop or a fed like 6 or 7 times throughout his career, right? Just solidifying this idea that Black people can play this game now as well as anybody else, and that representational politics attitude finding its way into our culture, into the movies that we watch, and etc. So let me, with that, throw it back to you, Shama.
Yeah, you can keep that bad boy slide up just for a minute. Yeah, so as Desmond mentioned, we are going to be doing a Will Smith episode. I think that he is such a good example of the critique doesn't have to take out the pleasure of it. I love Will Smith. He kind of represents a lot of things that I think are ruining the world, like respectability politics. But I just, there's nothing more charming than the first 3 seasons of Fresh Prince. I loved him in 6 Degrees of Separation. So we absolutely will have to talk about a lot about Will Smith. So that's an upcoming episode. Desmond mentioned The Wire. We've been talking about The Wire. I feel like for years now, I have not seen it. Desmond and I are currently watching Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which is one of my favorite shows. The Wire will come after that. So also stay tuned for some Deep Space Nine episodes. There's also a cop in it, Odo, the fast changeling. For those of you who know, but we are going to be doing probably multiple episodes on Deep Space Nine, and maybe then The Wire when we start watching that. Desmond brought up this idea of streaming as being one of the things that makes something like replay possible. It's been, very surprising to me that my students watch Friends. They watch all of these old shows. A couple of years ago, I remember when I was teaching at the University of Alberta, their like Students Association was organizing screenings of Friends episodes in the large lecture hall. Like these students, they watch it as like a relic from a simpler time when, all of those problems would have been solved with cell phones and GPS and Google. And so they're kind of compelled by it, I guess. But one of the things that I was thinking, and this is important when we think about historicizing the culture that we're talking about, when we were kids in the 90s, me and Desmond, you might have been a kid in another time. The 70s seemed really far away. Like 20 years ago was a really long time ago. And I don't think it's just because we were kids. It was because of accessibility. Culture kind of, it was like TV shows and movies, they came to the theater or your TV set, and then they kind of passed. DVDs, in the late 90s and 2000s maybe shifted that a little bit, but for the most part, the 70s seemed really far away. Even in the 2000s, maybe the 80s seemed kind of far away. 20 years ago, right now, seeing what my students are watching, they're watching The Office. They love The Office. They're watching all of those shows that are from 20 years ago because of these streaming. And so it's kind of compressing time in a way when culture does not fade in quite the way that it used to. And so something like replay, it's called replay because we're kind of replaying things that we love. It's not that we won't talk about things that are current, but it's really because of the ways that it feels like culture is getting kind of compressed in a way, the temporality of it. 20 years ago, the music that we were listening to is not like 70s music in the 90s. Okay, I'm going to talk about a few more examples. So next slide. I do not have a lot to say about Paw Patrol because I have not seen it, but this is Get 'em Young. You know what? Those puppies are cute. All puppies are cute. And it's the most perfect cute puppy face to put on cops. And I was talking to a parent about Paw Patrol, and they were like, yeah, our kid just loves it so much because it's so cute and they like the stories. And the puppies do not do any violence. They do not incarcerate anyone. They're not like scratching or doing like, whatever. They're not biting. They don't have guns. They're just taking care of their community. And this is one of the things that propaganda does. And that all of the kind of, not just propaganda in TV shows or movies, but the discourses around policing does. It takes something real that we want, we want our communities safe and we want our communities protected. And it says, we're going to give you cops. Like, that's the thing that's going to keep you safe, when we know, people who study this know that, strong communities make communities safe. Not like a cop coming in and with violence, right? So Paw Patrol is a kind of fantasy of what we want from policing, which the parent described it to me as the puppy just goes, just like, don't do this again, okay? And yeah, real police not really doing that. It's not, don't do this again, okay? And they don't have like a cute little, puppy face. And, we were looking at these slides earlier today. I'm just going to say Desmond was pointing out that there's even a brown puppy on this.
I had to. But, it's like, we also want to fantasize, just to build on what you just said, that it would be possible to live in a world where all the cops needed to do was be nicer and that we would all get along better.
Yeah, so the solutions to the violences that are fundamental to the institution of policing are just like, an individual has a little bit of, training and like not being racist. Like we will talk on anti-racist workshops is out of the scope of this hour that we have today, but this like fantasy that it's just about being nicer to each other, there's all kinds of Edmonton Police Services has a TikTok that's like full of this kind of thing, where it's just about, look at how cool and hip we are. Yeah, if you're on White Ave at any given night, you'll see what the cops are really doing. Okay, next slide.
Just out of curiosity, does the Edmonton Police Service have a breakdancing cop?
Oh gosh, I don't know, but they do have a cop.
Get yourself one of those. The kids love the cop, the white cop especially, who can breakdance. We expect the black guy to be able to breakdance. When the white cop breaks out and starts busting a move in uniform, kids love it. Just saying.
He's like cool and hip, he's not gonna do violence to you. How can he be racist when he loves Black culture so much? Everybody knows that, white people who love Black culture can't be racist. All right. Okay, so Brooklyn Nine-Nine. You know what? Brooklyn Nine-Nine, hilarious. It is a charming show. I think the acting and writing is great. I have, liked Andy Samberg for a long time. He's married to Joanna Newsom. Seems very charming. I like the characters like Captain Holt, who is a Black gay captain. It's a very diverse cast. Jake, the Andy Samberg character, one of his best friends is a criminal, and they never kill anybody. They don't shoot anybody by accident. They're not doing stop and frisk. They're not doing the things that we know that the NYPD does. And this is another kind of fantasy because, yeah, if you just have people who are like doing jokes and pranks on each other, and every once in a while when somebody needs something, they'll go help them. Yeah, that would be great. That is not what the NYPD is. This doesn't mean that you can't like the show, but this show does, what I was saying at the beginning of the talk, where it can no longer deny that racism exists or that homophobia exists. And so a lot of Captain Holt, his kind of backstory and, he wants to be police commissioner in some narrative arcs is, do you know what it's like to be not just a Black cop, but a gay cop? And, really talking about discrimination against him as an individual because of these identity categories. But it's like, what do you think the police is? Like, what do the police, right? What are the kind of norms that the police as an institution are there to uphold? But it narrates it narrates out of making those things visible. It makes it visible, and then it says, but look at how well they're taking care of their communities. Now, after the uprisings of 2020 for Black Lives, the show, I did not see the new season, but I do know that one of the women of color in the show, her character left the police service, saying like, actually policing does have systemic problem. I'm not sure if they go so far as to say it's like an institutional fundamentally, but they're really trying to grapple with this because, they're good liberals who did good representational politics by having such a diverse cast. And then the uprisings of 2020, which were a real kind of capital E event, needed to be incorporated and adapted around in some way. And I think the most perfect TV show that incorporated and adapted around that is the one on the next slide. So, oh boy. Desmond and I laughed for about like at least a solid like 3 minutes earlier today at this poster.
What is going on here? I can't get over this. Like, please continue.
Yeah. So I love watching Marvel movies. They're absolutely, the purpose of Marvel movies is to launder imperialism. Like that is the very like fundamental purpose of this. We know there are theorists who talk about imperialism and domestic violence in imperial centers and settler colonialism. Nikhil Pal Singh calls this the inner wars, the kind of inner war against Black and Indigenous people, and the outer war, that are all of the kind of wars of imperialism in West Asia, South America, Africa, etc. Falcon and Winter Soldier brings the inner and outer war together really perfectly. Like I work on adaptations of racial capitalism, and if somebody told me like write the most like containing of any kind of like radical any kind of radical critique show that you could possibly think of, it is narrating the it's not just a Black cop. So those other examples were Black cops. It is narrating a Black man becoming Captain America, America, the, imperialist, settler, colonial, racial capitalist, founded on slavery and genocide state. He becomes Captain America, and his conflict, is both personal, that, how can I take this over because Steve Rogers was so great? And it is racial in that he sees another super soldier who says, no Black man who, they would never make a Black man Captain America. And if they wanted to, no self-respecting Black man would take it. And the whole story is to narrate him taking it. And so it foregrounds this critique. It cannot deny that critique anymore. Actually, the bad guys are flag smashers. That's what they're called. And I'm like, yeah, smash flags. That's like good, actually. So, they really foreground this, but only in order to contain it. And the kicker at the end of Falcon and Winter Soldier is that man, the super soldier, the older, like he's like 100 years old or something, Black man who was tortured by the state, incarcerated and tortured, while Steve Rogers, the white super soldier, became Captain America. He gets put into a museum, and it's like, did you all not listen to Eric Killmonger when he went into the British Museum and was like, museums are bad, actually, or museums are sites of colonial and imperial violence? No, that's even in the same franchise. They didn't listen. They actually contain it so perfectly by putting the person they had say a Black man shouldn't take Captain America because of the violence that's fundamental to America. And then he's happy because he gets put into a museum. This guy, Falcon becomes Captain America, happy ending. He's going to change things from the inside, hope and change and whatever, all of that. And so really the perfect show for this kind of narrative containment.
You said hope and change, and I was literally thinking while I was looking at this and listening to you that this has got to be Obama's favorite new series, like coming out in the next 5 years. Like this was did he executive produce this? Is there something I haven't heard? Because like it's so perfect. Um, just for our friends doing the tech, now that we're done with these slides, I want to bring it back, if I can, off of share screen to just the two of us. So if you want to just throw open the chat when it's okay for me to do that. But I wanted to also mention really quickly too, because you mentioned The Office, Shama, that people should really watch the British version of The Office. If people are watching The Office and going back and having that nostalgia moment, which I totally recommend that you do, make sure that you watch the British version of The Office as well. You will be very upset because Ricky Gervais got there before everybody else did. And I have to say, Steve Carell, in my opinion, has nothing on Ricky Gervais in terms of like that awkward, completely uncomfortable, like cringe watching. Ricky Gervais really captured that so properly. So you want to see the British version of The Office. A lot of people don't even know it exists. And also, I think it would be really cool for when people are submitting questions, which we're about to get to, that if you want to tell us some of the older programming that you're watching, perhaps, because you have access to these kinds of streaming services. So maybe you're not necessarily catching up on everything from the last year or two. Maybe you're going and watching old shows. And if so, like, which shows are you watching and why? Why are the ones that you're watching the ones that have held your interest or that piqued your interest in the first place? So I'm going to take this off of our share screen now. I think we're back. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Shama and Desmond. And I'll just reiterate one more time, if there are questions, have a look at that live chat. You can type them in there and I can pass them along to Shama and Desmond here. So we'll get to some of those in a minute. First, I wanted to I'm going to ask you about how this project came into being. But I wanted to say too that, you know, both of you are doing such important and timely work on anti-racism and decolonization in Canada specifically. And you're really helping to guide these conversations, and you're doing this at a time when these conversations are both incredibly necessary and really incredibly difficult as well. As a white scholar, I don't pretend to know how difficult that must be, but I imagine the work that you're doing is emotionally and intellectually challenging, and probably at times it can be quite exhausting. And I say this, first of all, to express my admiration for the work that both of you do. It's courageous and it's important. And I just wanted to express that. I'm also interested in how this project, Replay, the podcast, fits into that broader framework that you're working on. The podcast and, you know, our discussion today, which is a lot of fun, it's obviously driven by critical theory and social analysis and these other kinds of concerns, but it also seems to me that that it's also born out of a genuine love of popular culture, whether that's coming from television or Hollywood and other sources of popular culture. So my first question here then is, could you tell us what gave rise to this specific project, Replay, and maybe how it might be similar to or different from the other stuff that you do in your day jobs, let's call it that.
Shama, you want to go first?
Yeah, so a few years ago, you know, I started doing kind of more public work, and it really gave meaning to the kind of scholarly work that I was doing, because a lot of academia is just, you know, sitting around reading theory and having conversations with other academics, but also living in a moment of multiple crises, which I know that Dave is also an thing that you work on as well, thinking about crisis. And I wanted to look not at, you know, political economy or the material conditions, but rather the ideologies that kind of sustain all of these kind of material exclusions and dominations. So yeah, getting into kind of cultural studies, more, or using those examples I would find when I was doing when I was giving kind of more public talks it would always help to have some kind of pop culture example to explain the sort of thing that I'm talking about. So even explaining, if I tell somebody I work on adaptations of, racial capitalism during a time of liberal crisis, what does that mean? Well, if I talk about, the 2020 uprisings as an event that actually was a kind of rupture, and how liberalism like adapted kind of around that, through pop culture, through that narrative. It's not just happening in the cultural domain, because I think that this election of Kamala Harris as vice president is part of that containment too, and that's not in the culture, that's in the political realm. But using a cultural example, I think can help make it a bit clearer, these kinds of things that we're talking about in very kind of theoretical ways sometimes. So that is the kind of day job connection piece. Just to respond to what you were saying about like this work being difficult to think through, it's we need pleasures in our lives. And actually, like doing this podcast is a real pleasure. It's really fun to talk about this pop culture. It does relate very directly to, I think, both of the work that we do, which, is not the same, but I think complementary, which is why, like, when we have discussions about whatever the topic of the podcast is for that episode, we're approaching it, with similar kind of politics, but we have complementary things to say. And it's just been really fun. It's just been a pleasure, and it's been it's so fun to think of new episodes and things like that. But yeah, go ahead, Des.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we started watching Deep Space Nine last winter when the pandemic started, as a kind of way of just dealing with the dreariness of being at home a lot more and being really freaked out like everybody else was. And, the whole time that we've known each other, Shama has been raving about how important it is to watch Deep Space Nine and how much it's formed her thinking. And it's just a show that she loves. So we started watching, and I think that's probably where the real genesis for doing this started. And yeah, I definitely agree about the pleasure part of this as well, because for myself, like, I have conversations about culture, about books, about movies and stuff with friends all the time. And we go and see theater when you could still do that. And, we talk later on about the things that we saw on stage and what it made us feel or think about. And that's why we enjoy art. And so it's natural to have these conversations. I can think of a conversation, speaking of all this propaganda, actually, with a really good friend of mine who was really devoted to a Canadian show. And, sometimes in a lot of my work, I'm always trying to bring us to Canada. Everything we just showed on the screen here today, and so much of the cultural product that we're talking about generally, is American. And there's a reason for that. But my friend was in love with this CTV show called Flashpoint. And Flashpoint was all about police and de-escalation. And so how could they go into these really tense situations where a bomb was going to go off, or where there's a hostage situation, and make sure that everybody gets out alive, gets out safely without being physically injured, that the police don't take any more of a kind of physical risk to themselves or others than is necessary. Another fantasy, but perhaps a little bit closer to the one that we talk about today when we start to talk about detasking the police, even defunding or abolishing the police, is to say that the kinds of violence that we've come to know policing for are actually not necessary to do the job, and trying to explore that through a show. This is a conversation that I have had many times with a friend of mine as we live our real lives in Toronto and watch police, for example, go into homeless encampments and brutalize people. She's in marketing, but we still talk about film, and we talk about movies and shows and plays and things, because I feel like that's how all of us in some way relate to the culture, relate to the moments that we're in, and help ourselves to think about different things.
Yeah, and I think there's a really important insight there. And one of the things that both of you are signaling is that there's an event or a series of events associated with Black Lives Matter, which obviously has brought us to, as a society, as a nation, to rethink some of our assumptions about policing and about race. Especially in Canada, we seem to have this idea that, these are American problems. But the other side of it, you mentioned, Desmond, is this idea of replaying in the context of COVID-19 and the lockdown and that kind of thing. It really is an odd cultural moment in which we have this strange, timeless time to kind of revisit old shows and think about these broader arcs and the historical narratives that led to contemporary culture. I think that was probably added to by the fact that a lot of television shows and movies kind of weren't being made at that time. There's a question here from a viewer. Katie asks, what about, or how do women cops fit into propaganda? And they mentioned specifically the show HBO's Watchmen, the female character who is named Angela.
Yeah, I can speak a bit broadly about how women fit into propaganda. So with the expansion of policing and of who is legible as criminal, a lot of that had to do with the kind of specter of sexual violence. And so you would have the kind of stranger jumping out of the bushes, a lot of PSAs, things that were taught in schools, that were on the evening news. What news stories were circulating were a lot of like, we need cops to protect women. Now, we have to be very clear that that was not happening at this time, that the place where women were the least safe were in the domestic sphere, right? And so if it was sexual violence from a partner, the cops don't care about that. It was all about expanding policing. This also was happening, in the 90s. Think about like, the 6 p.m. news, right? And the Clinton crime bill is something that is a kind of specter haunting a lot of these cop shows that we're talking about. And so to have women cops, when cops historically were shown as these kind of masculine protectors of women, of a particular kind of bourgeois white women, showed a kind of women's agency. It made these women, they were like tough broads, right, who are part of the police force, but also this like gender essentializing fantasy of women being less violent than men. And so look, we're diversifying. Like if you think that it's just a bro culture, now we also know this idea that police protect women from sexual violence is untrue because of the sexual violence that happens within police forces as well, right? And so this is all still on the level of propaganda. The police are out there, and it's usually like a racialized man who is the face of criminality, usually a Black or Indigenous man or a Muslim man. Particularly in Europe, it's like the Muslim immigrant, right, or man who's doing the sexual violence. But actual women are not being protected by policing, but showing that there are women in the shows is just another kind of diversity, and it's showing women as agential, and it's also gender essentializing that women would be gentler than a male cop, which is not true. I mean, it's like, I don't care about Gina Haspel being the head of the CIA, right? She ran a black site in Thailand. Like, we don't need more women cops.
I haven't seen HBO's The Watchmen yet. Thank you for the question. I'm thinking of a couple of things here just flooded into my mind. One of them is that if you want an insight into Canadian policing today, type in the words RCMP or whatever local police force across Canada that you would like to research, and then add, you can search up whether it's, sexual misconduct complaints, or, everybody probably who's been paying attention in the news has been hearing a lot about gendered violence in the RCMP. This is a feature of Canadian policing. It's not a bug. It's how things are today. Extreme amounts of violence towards women, towards the very few trans and non-binary people who make it into our police forces, endemic. How does that play out in some of our culture? I'm thinking of the show Search Party, that I unfortunately fell down a hole of. Search Party really made me so upset because I loved the direction it was going for like one season, and then they completely did a 180 and went into like, anyway, that's for a whole podcast, I think. But there's this amazing sub narrative in Search Party. Spoiler alert, I will spoil this for you. There's a Black woman who plays a police officer, and this Black cop is sent on the trail of a bad guy who doesn't exist. The bad guy's just been made up by somebody in the story to actually themselves avoid some problems with the police. But this Black woman goes searching for this bad guy, and she ends up shooting a man who she believes is this bad guy. And then she has a decision to make, because now she's shot a civilian who presumably has nothing to do with the case that she's working on. And she has to think about what's going to happen to her as a Black woman when she goes back to the station and has to talk about this, or when she radios for backup. Are people going to have her back the way that they would a white cop, a white woman cop, or even a white man cop? What she decides that she's going to do is actually severely injure herself so that she can say she got into a confrontation with this person that she shot and had to be heroic and kill him. And it is devastating what she has to do to herself. And then you see her being so scared when she goes back to work that everybody knows and that everybody is going to find her out. And the way that this Black woman's paranoia is portrayed, the way that she fears that she has to do this to herself because otherwise no one is going to have her back, is one of the most honest and well-scripted portrayals of what it could be like for a Black woman in a policing experience. It was kind of real to me in a sense. Like, I thought it was extremely well done. The reality, though, is that we have situations like, I'm going to end on this. There's a woman in Toronto, or sorry, in Brampton, Mississauga area, just west of Toronto, and her name is Chantal Krupka. Chantal Krupka was shot last year by a police officer who happens to be a woman, and that woman was just recently sentenced. She pled guilty to one of 3 criminal charges and made a deal with the Crown to have the other more serious charges against her dismissed. But notably, she resigned from the police force before her criminal hearing. Again, probably because even as a white woman, her name is Valerie Briffa. I don't think Valerie Briffa was going to get the support and, dare I say, brotherhood of her colleagues as a man who shot a woman for no reason would have in that situation. So she actually resigned her job from the police force before it ever went to trial. And that's the state of policing in this country today for women, is that they're still expected to do all of the violence, but they will never receive the same kind of support and backing and validation that their male white counterparts will.
Yeah. I think, thanks for that, Desmond and Shama. I think we're pretty much out of time here. I have like 23 more questions, but I guess the thing to do is, if everybody wants more critical analysis of culture, you can make sure to follow at Replay the Pod on Twitter. And I think you can find the podcast on Spotify and other media sites as well. So I just want to close by saying thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to the Speaker Series Committee, Soroya Mole and Leonard Naka, for organizing this series. And of course, to the Communication Arts Department at the University of Waterloo. Thank you, of course, to you, Shama and Desmond, for sharing with us this evening. Everybody else, find the podcast. If you haven't found Desmond's book already, make sure you do that as well. And of course, thank you so much to the audience, for all of you for showing up, for joining. And take care. And we will see everyone again soon. Thank you again.
Thank you.